Well, hey, AP Bio students, Mrs. Shelton here, and my cat Russell. He is going to be with me today as long as he wants to because he's a cat. We are going to be talking today about Chapter 40, Population Ecology and the Distribution of Organisms. So with this, of your ecology unit, so this is the beginning of Unit 8 on ecology, the last unit of the AP Biology curriculum. There are 4 chapters that we're going to be covering here, chapter 40, 41, 42, and 43. Today's lecture, though, is just chapter 40, which actually is about half of the content that you're going to need to know for this particular unit. Now, also for chapter 40, because it is content heavy, what I would ask you guys to do is also make sure you go through that test prep review series book. So in that test prep review series that I have also scanned and it's on Schoology, this is topic number 10. And so this is the beginning of topic number 10. And so what you're going to want to do is actually go through after this lecture and after you've taken the notes, go through page 269 through 277. So 269 through 277 is going to just summarize for what College Board needs you guys to know from chapter 40. So what we're going to do is go through the PowerPoint. This particular PowerPoint that I am including is going to be a little bit easier for you guys to use. I'm going to talk through it pretty fast just so you're not listening to me for over an hour. It'd probably be torturous. But when you go back to Schoology and you click on this actually has a lot of the terms and definitions and a lot of detailed content that's also embedded in this particular PowerPoint. So I'll kind of show you that, but then when I do start speeding up and just flying through it to give you guys some examples, recognize that you can go back to Schoology and pull this up and then get some of those terms and definitions if you want to use those. So in chapter 40, what we are discussing here is we're talking about ecology. With ecology, like any ology, it's a study of, but it's the ecosystem, the study of the interactions between organisms and the environment. So when we talk about ecological studies, it's really important that we understand the terms biotic and abiotic, because that's what ecology is dealing with, is that study of how the living and the non-living factors are all interacting. Now, the interactions are going to be determining the distribution of organisms. And here's actually just what our textbook kind of points out to us in the beginning, is that these would be some kind of research questions that ecologists might ask, is what are some environmental factors limiting the distribution of the species? So that's going to be a main topic we address. And then also we're going to be addressing interactions that affect population size. So distribution, and then also population size will be a main topic for this particular chapter. Now, look at this little guy. He is so adorable. Look at this little frog. So what is amazing about this frog, and this might be something that an ecologist asked, is what are some of the factors that are going to limit the population size and also this distribution of where this particular frog can live? Well, I mean, we have to consider all the biotic and abiotic factors that are going to influence, because here's how big he is on a dime. And here's this little teeny tiny little frog. So with that, what are some of those things? I mean, my obvious thought that I have when I look here is, well, predation. He's pretty small, so he's going to be food for a lot of other organisms. But you have to research and figure out what are those factors that are affecting where this little tiny frog can live. Now, in the opening segment, it does talk about all the different levels of ecology. So within that study of ecology, we can look from that large global level all the way down to the organismal ecology. You do not need to know all of these differences and what they are. Just kind of recognize we can go from really high levels of organization down to smaller levels of organization in order to study then this distribution and size, all those biotic and abiotic factors that are influencing it. Now, in chapter 40, section 1, this topic, Earth's climate influences the distribution of terrestrial biomes. So terrestrial biomes being our land biomes, big term that we need to make sure that we're recognizing is this word climate. When we think of climate, climate is really the average weather patterns. When we do talk about climate, the things that we are talking about is the average temperature, average precipitation, the amount of sunlight, and also wind. These are all things that affect then these different terrestrial biomes. Now, there's just another definition of biotic, abiotic, your living versus your non-living things within an ecosystem. But also understanding that global climate patterns are going to have a huge influence over the distribution of these different terrestrial biomes, where life and how life is distributed on land. Now, when we do talk about our global climate patterns, a few things to just recognize is just that angle of the sun. That angle of the sun, how it actually hits the earth, is going to actually change how much heat is distributed. And so, with that, that's going to give a lot of differences in air circulation and precipitation patterns. So, remember that high heat is going to move towards lower heat, and that's basic thermodynamics. So with that, that's going to be creating different patterns of wind distribution, of water distribution. Again, you don't need to know, what are westerlies and northeast trades, but just recognize that that uneven heating pattern of the earth is going to cause these different wind patterns and the shifting of the water. Now, we also talk about the seasonality. We know that we happen to live in an area where we have at least two distinct seasons. I mean, we basically have since we're in California, we have supposed to be four different seasons, but it's all based on the tilt of the axis of the Earth, and so it changes then that focus of how much light is actually being distributed. So through the summer and through when we're out of school, it gets really hot in this area because we're getting a lot of direct sun, and then the opposite time during our winter time, so that's when we're going to not get as much direct sun, and so that's going to be changing our different weather patterns. Now, bodies of water also influence climate as well. So in California, we actually happen to have very mild climate change. And so we know that in our particular area, I mean, we do get highs up into about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but our lows usually sometimes get down to freezing. And a lot of that mildness, but if we look at our climate, however, our climate is going to be pretty stable. About 60 degrees Fahrenheit is kind of our average climate temperature. And that's because this California current, so this ocean, this is a cold water current that actually helps stabilize our weather pattern and keeps our temperatures pretty constant. Where if you were then over on the East Coast, if you've ever been on the East Coast during the summertime, you know how muggy and hot it gets because of this hot, warmer climate or Gulf Stream. So this particular current is going to be carrying more moisture with it, and that's going to be changing our local climate patterns as well. Be aware that where mountains are. This actually very much reminds me of just that drive up to Tahoe. So here we're in the valley, and we start getting up into Auburn in this particular area, and it's nice and green and lush and lots of chaparral. And then we get up to the mountains, and we get our temperate forests up there, and our coniferous forests. Then we get over to Reno. Like, ugh, Reno, and it's just ugly and dry, and it's just now it's high desert. Well, that's because all the water and the snow ends up falling on this windward side of the mountain, and then there's no moisture over on that leeward side. So that's going to be changing then what type of productivity occurs in that area and what type of life is there as well. So understand just some of those basics. Now, you should be familiar with some different biomes and some of these major life zones that are characterized by vegetation type. But when we talk about our biomes, this would be a good map just to kind of be able to recognize that where some of these biomes exist. In our particular area, we happen to be in a lot of grassland, and so temperate grassland and chaparral tends to be the biomes in which we live in. But this would be a skill that you guys should be able to use, and this skill is actually reading a climograph. And so from this climograph, what we can actually see down here is this is the average mean precipitation, so how much water, and then this is average mean temperature. We can actually see that those two factors of temperature and precipitation often dictate what biomes are going to exist in that particular area. Now, you do not have to memorize tropical rainforest, savanna, desert, here's our chaparral. That's what a lot of California is, our grasslands. That's what a lot of the Central Valley that we live in is grasslands. Our northern coniferous forest, your broadleaf forest, or also this would be our temperate forest, would what we'd be talking about there. Tundra, we do not have tundra in California, but if you go up to Canada, northern California, or northern Canada and Alaska, you're going to see more tundra in that particular area. But it's just recognizing just some of those different habitats that are actually created because of the average temperature and the average rainfall is going to dictate what plants live in those particular areas. Now, in aquatic biomes, we need to make sure that we're understanding. So for chapter 40.2, in aquatic biomes, these are also very diverse systems as well, humongous amount of life that exists. But now what we actually have to be factoring in is the salinity, would be the other abiotic factor that we need to be addressing. Also, oxygen levels would be another factor that we need to be addressing in what determines the type of life that is there. Now, sunlight is the huge major deciding factor in what life does exist. When we do talk about, this would be a diagram to make sure that you're aware of, when we do talk about our aquatic biomes, this photic zone is a region that light can penetrate to. So we're going to obviously have a lot of photosynthesis in that particular area. Down here, light can't penetrate down in these areas, so that would be the aphotic zone where no light is. Another factor that's going to be influencing what life can exist in that particular area is whether or not there's light and there's the bottom. So this is going to be determining now if we actually have plants that are sessile or anchor down to the bottom, or if we're going to have ones that are actually just floating, kind of like our phytoplankton that are going to just be in this photic zone in there. So just be aware of some of those major zones and some of the criteria that are going to be influencing our aquatic biomes. Now, recognize too, water or aquatic ecosystems have thermoclines. And so this thermocline are these differences in temperature. And you guys know, if you've ever swam in a body of water, you actually get that upper layer is much warmer, that the bottom layer is much colder, and then the deeper you go, you get more pressure too. And so that's going to be creating these temperature boundaries, and also it's going to be creating some little microcurrents inside water systems as well. Some videos you guys can watch if you choose to. But you should also then be able to identify wetlands and estuaries. When we talk about a wetland, these are areas that actually have access to soil, but usually these wetlands actually have just kind of a thin layer of water over the top, lots and lots of plants, but the soil usually is very, very saturated. And then estuaries then are going to be at that transition between freshwater versus saltwater. And so these particular plants and animals need to be adapted to that change in salinity that's going to be occurring. So be familiar with your wetlands and your estuaries as well. Now, when it comes to lakes, when we do talk about lakes, something you should be addressing when we do talk about that is an oligotrophic lake versus a eutrophic lake. So your oligotrophic lakes are going to be your nutrient poor, but yet generally very oxygen rich type of lakes. And then eutrophic lakes, these are very nutrient rich, and because of all the nutrients, actually oxygen is in high demand because there's usually so many organisms that are fighting for that use of that oxygen in those water systems. Oligotrophic lakes would be like our Lake Tahoe. If you've ever been up to Lake Tahoe, it's nice and clear and clean, high oxygen levels, but with that, we're going to see, didn't have a picture of a eutrophic lake. If you've ever been over a Folsom Lake, that would be an example then of a eutrophic lake in order to look at those. So obviously, if we talk about streams and rivers, then we're actually going to have just more turbulence and more water flow. That's actually going to increase the amount of oxygen that now gets mixed into the water too. But obviously, there's some differences in what plants can live in this moving water. So again, some abiotic factors that are going to be influencing the type of life that can exist. So be familiar with some of these differences in aquatic biomes, read through those, and just make sure that you are comfortable with those different abiotic factors that influence our aquatic ecosystems. In chapter 40.3, this is actually when you're talking a little bit more about dispersal and distribution. So interactions between organisms and the environment limit the distribution of a species. When we do talk about the distribution of a species, um, this is actually where we would find them. Um, there's ecological factors, there's evolutionary history. So here they're giving you an example of why kangaroos are only in Australia. And Australia is a continent that's not connected to anything else, so it's a geographic type of isolation. So that would be an abiotic factor that is influencing that distribution. So when we do talk about distribution, what we're really addressing is where are those species found and why? And those factors could include food availability, predators, temperature. Those are all different factors that could influence that type of distribution. When we do talk about dispersal, dispersal is that movement of individuals away from that. So with that dispersal, where do they go? Is what we're kind of looking at. Here's then some biotic factors that influence this distribution of organisms: predation, herbivory, mutualism, parasitism, competition. Actually, our next chapter is going to be addressing these types of relationships a little bit more. So right now, these terms may or may not have any meaning to you. There's just some abiotic factors that would affect distribution: temperature, water, oxygen, salinity, sunlight, rock, soil. Those would be some examples of some abiotic factors. Now, in chapter 40.4, density and dispersion, these would be some terms that we definitely need to make sure that we're comfortable with. If we are talking about the density of a population, we are talking about number of individuals per area is what we're addressing. And then if we're talking about dispersion, this is the pattern of spacing. So when we do address density, density things that affect density are going to be birth rate and immigration. Those are factors that are going to increase the density of a population. And then death rate and emigration are going to be decreasing the density of a population. So those should be pretty logical understandings of things that affect your population size or your density, which is amount of individuals per given area. Now, patterns of dispersion are really addressing here how the individuals of a population are organized. Now, influences here are actually going to be food sources, availability of resources, or if there's a territorialism or something like that. The most common type, and what we need to make sure that we know is the most common type of or pattern of dispersion is clumped, is what we're going to be seeing. Uniform, here we've got these penguins that are more in this uniform pattern, and then random is just what that means, is it's just going to be the random distribution. So in a little bit more detail, if we take out all the other pictures, again, clumped is the most common. Uniform would be if there's now this territorial type of behavior that exists. Random now is something like in those seeds, it was just random on where the seeds actually landed. There's really no rhyme or reason as to why there's that particular organization. Now, again, with clumped, with this, again, most common. Here, oftentimes, resources tend to be clumped. Also, there's safety in numbers as far as predation, as far as terms of avoiding being predation or being the prey as well. So also in finding a mate, being clumped and close together is actually a little bit easier too. So clumped typically is the more common way that we see that. Uniform, again, uniform, what I said before, there's going to be more territoriality. Say that 5 times really fast. Like these penguins, they are fighting for their territory, so they're more uniform. And then it's random is really just usually the resources are pretty uniform all the way across, but this distribution of the seeds, it's where those seeds happen to fall, is where those dandelions are going to be growing. So it's random as far as what that distribution is going to be. When we do talk about demographics, that term demographics that you guys should know is really addressing the that statistics of the population and how they change over time is what we're addressing. You should be familiar with what a life table looks like. And so life tables are going to be age-specific summaries, is what that life table is going to be. And life tables are going to be constructed from and about the sexually reproducing females is usually what they're going to be representing, because since females produce the offspring, that's what we're looking at, is to see also through life tables whether or not this is a population that is stable. Is this a population that is growing, or is this a population size that happens to be in decline? And you actually look at those reproducing females and the number of reproducing females in order to determine that. So here would be a life table, is what we would be looking at of ground squirrels, and looking at where and how many, kind of what this distribution is. And then what you'd also need to know here is how many offspring are they actually producing each year, in order to make some predictions about this particular population. You do need to know survivorship curves. So you should be familiar with this graph of survivorship curves when we do talk about different species and how different species actually have these kind of live their life. And the amount of, if we look here, I mean, we are a type 1 versus type 2 versus type 3 survivorship curve. And what this means is that in our percentage of our lifespan, the majority of deaths occur later in life. That's what they are actually showing here. In a type 2 survivorship curve, deaths actually occur at any stage and at a very, set, just kind of a very predictable, unset time of when deaths do occur all along there, either the beginning of their life, the middle of their life, or later in life. And then there's other types of organisms like this where there's a very high death rate right in the early stages of life, and then a very long period of very few of them surviving to 100%. So these would be a high number of babies born. This is usually then a very low number of babies born, and this is kind of an even number, kind of these little 5 to 10, and so you get this kind of even steady death rate. But type 1 is more like humans, type 2 would be more like your little ground squirrels, and then something like an oyster or something like that would be a type 3. So recognize those would be something you guys should be looking at. Now in 40.5, I highly suggest you do some of the practice problems in here in order to make sure that you can calculate some population sizes, and also looking at calculating exponential growth rates as well. So pay attention to those. But one of the major parts to make sure that you do understand in here is you do understand the difference between exponential growth. So if we have exponential growth rates, it creates this J-shaped curve of population sizes increasing. But then we need to make sure that we recognize that exponential growth can never be sustained for a long period of time, because every particular population has a carrying capacity, and carrying capacity is represented by K. So a logistic population growth is actually a more logical pattern that organisms follow, and that creates this S-shaped curve. So this will be the graph that I would ask you guys to make sure that you know of what the exponential growth rate is, but then what the logistic growth model is, where growth rate starts slowing down as you get closer to that carrying capacity of the population. And the carrying capacity for the population is really how many organisms can that environment support. It's kind of the limit on growth that happens to be there. Now, it never looks as perfect as this because the amount of resources are fluctuating all the time, and sometimes you get populations that overshoot the carrying capacity, and then they get fast death rates. But no exponential growth versus logistic growth, and recognize that logistic growth is being controlled by K, by carrying capacity. Well, other things before we go. When we talk about our life histories, so a life history in 40.6, what we should be addressing in life history, it's a little bit different than survivorship curves, but with life history, what we're looking at is how many offspring are produced during that reproductive episode, and along with that, where is then the death rate? And what you should know is that if you're producing a high amount of offspring, with each reproductive episode, there's an expectation that there's also a lot of those offspring are dying at that particular time. Tends to be an energy trade-off is what ends up occurring. So if we take a look at K selection versus R selection, K selection and R selection, oh, there's not a good graph for that. K selection with this tends to be carrying capacity is playing a major role in here. Population densities are very close to that carrying capacity. When this is occurring, usually there is a lower amount of births, a higher amount of now protection of those offspring. In R selection, this is a density independent selection. And so here, there's going to be a lot of reproduction. At this particular, with R selection, oftentimes there's very low amounts of parental support, and so you do get a higher death rate here. Easy way to remember this, K is like a kangaroo. So with kangaroos, they usually have their one joey, they take really good care of that joey, and so that joey then tends to survive. And R selection, R is for rabbits, lots of babies. Have them, pump them out, good luck, buddy. And last but not least, we do need to make sure that we're understanding some of these in population controls, density independent and density dependent population controls. So when we do talk about density, so again, what we're addressing here are just some of these factors that are going to influence population sizes. And if I say density independent, what this means is that as the population gets larger, these density independent factors don't change. They're not going to change because the population is getting bigger. Density dependent, as that population does get bigger, these factors will alter then the population size. So let's give you a couple examples here. So if we're talking about density dependent, and this is what most are, density dependent birth rates. So let's actually just take a look here. There is a nice graph that's actually showing us a lot of these density dependent factors that are going to influence, as the population gets bigger, what's going to slow down the particular birth rates. So competition for resources would be the obvious one. Predation is going to be the obvious one because now there is more food. Here there is more competition for food. Disease is a density dependent factor. What we're seeing right now with COVID-19. Higher density populations now can transmit that disease at a much faster rate because that population density is so high. So be familiar with just what that means, density dependent versus density independent factors, where density dependent is the main thing. Last term on your list, know what a metapopulation is. Metapopulations, these are groups of populations that are linked by immigration or emigration. Metapopulations include like a lot of these huge flocks of migrating birds. We've got to calculate those and calculate in those metapopulations, like the geese in our area. So the Canadian geese, some of them who just say, I'm staying in Rockland, instead of flying up to Canada or back down to Mexico, those would be part of larger metapopulations, is what they would be a part of. So with that, that is chapter 40, really in a fast nutshell. There's a lot of detail. Again, read your textbook chapter, do the notes outline, go back through this PowerPoint on Schoology, and then that should be enough for you then to move on. So there are those concept check questions. Remember, the answers are in the back of the book for those as well. So with that, good luck with your reading. I will be posting the chapter 41 through 43 lectures in just a bit, but chapter 40 should take you about a day to 2 days to make sure you go through that content and give it your full attention is what you should be doing. So with that,